You begin to feel what it means to truly belong to yourself. For so long, you equated belonging with being accepted by others. You tried to fit in rooms that made you small. You quieted your ideas, diluted your presence, wore masks that didn't match your soul. But that kind of belonging came with a cost. It required you to leave parts of yourself behind. Now you're building a home within, a space where you are never too much, where your silence is honored, where your thoughts can roam without fear of being judged. You realize that the kind of belonging that lasts is the one you build brick by brick, with self-trust, with self-respect, with self-love. You become more intentional about the way you love, not louder, not grander, but deeper. You start asking better questions. What helps you feel safe? What softens your heart? What makes you feel seen? You begin offering love that doesn't overwhelm or demand. You hold space. You listen without trying to fix. You support without suffocating. You allow people to be who they are instead of trying to shape them into who you need. And when it comes to yourself, you do the same. You no longer love yourself as a reward for success. You love yourself through the mess, through the confusion, through the quiet days, because that's what real love does. It stays. You start noticing how differently peace feels when it's something you protect, not just something you stumble into. You stop letting your boundaries be negotiable. You stop entertaining chaos disguised as passion. You start choosing who and what has access to your nervous system. If something consistently brings tension, you don't keep inviting it in just because it once made you feel alive. You choose calm. You choose safety. You understand now that drama is not a sign of depth, that silence is not a lack of connection, that ease isn't boring. It's beautiful. It's what you've been yearning for. And now that you've tasted it, you're not giving it up. You let go of the fantasy that healing means you'll never feel hurt again, that peace means you'll never feel anxious, that growth means you'll never fall back. You understand now that healing is a dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You learn to embrace the stumbles as much as the strides. You don't shame yourself for the days you feel like you're unraveling. You trust the unraveling. You know that sometimes things need to fall apart so they can return in a truer form. You hold your pain like you would a child, tenderly, patiently. You don't rush it away. You let it soften, and it always does. You begin to redefine forgiveness. You no longer see it as a free pass or a denial of harm. You see it as an act of release, not because they deserve it, but because you do. You understand that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. It doesn't need closure from someone who was never capable of giving it. You don't need their apology to be at peace. You offer it to yourself. You stop carrying the weight of what they did. You set it down. You don't forget, but you free yourself from the responsibility of holding it. You reclaim your power, not through revenge, but through release. You start to enjoy your own company, not just tolerate it. You find joy in the way you hum while cooking, in the way you talk to yourself while thinking through something, in the way your own mind surprises you with kindness. You stop filling the room with distractions. You let your silence speak. You let your thoughts arrive without judgment. You begin to feel like a friend to yourself, not the kind that gives advice or fixes problems, but the kind who just sits beside you with no agenda, the kind who says, "I love you, I'm here." You realize now, you've been searching for that presence in others, but it's been inside you all along. You stop rushing your healing. You stop trying to impress anyone with how quickly you've moved on or how unfazed you've become. You allow the emotions to linger as long as they need. You understand that grief doesn't have a deadline, that letting go isn't a single decision, but a series of quiet surrenders. You stop putting pressure on yourself to feel okay when you're still bleeding. You honor the wound, you tend to it, you give it sunlight, time, and truth. And when it finally begins to close, you do not forget it. You thank it. You let it become part of your story, not the end, but a turning point. And somewhere in all this, between the letting go and the letting be, you realize that you're no longer afraid of your own reflection. You see yourself clearly, and you don't flinch. You don't pick apart every flaw. You don't tear down what's soft, what's tired, what's different. You look and see someone who is trying, who is healing, who is showing up despite the weight. And in that moment, you whisper to yourself what you once longed to hear from others. You are enough. You always were. There comes a time when you stop looking for answers in places that only ever gave you. There are seasons in life that don't begin with a shift in the weather, but with the unraveling of who you thought you were. No external signal, no announcement, just a quiet breaking inside you. A quiet knowing that the way you've been living no longer fits. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a lightning strike or an overnight change. It's subtle, like a garment that starts to feel too tight, like shoes that once fit but now cause blisters, like a story you've been telling yourself for years, suddenly sounding unfamiliar in your own voice. You catch yourself in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. Not because you've changed physically, but because something deeper has shifted, and you don't quite know what it is yet. But you know this: something old is ending, and something new is whispering from within. You begin to feel the discomfort of living in between chapters. The past no longer holds you, but the future hasn't yet arrived. You're suspended, floating, undefined. You want clarity, but life only offers you silence. And at first, that silence is terrifying. You try to fill it with noise, old habits, old people, old stories, but none of it feels like home anymore. You realize you've outgrown the version of yourself that once found safety in those things. The conversations that once lit you up now feel hollow. The places that once brought you peace now echo with restlessness. You're standing in the doorway between who you were and who you're becoming. And for a while, it's tempting to turn back, to settle for the familiar discomfort of the known rather than the fear of what's ahead. But you don't. Something inside you, soft yet steady, tells you to keep walking. You begin to notice your body becoming a compass. It reacts before your mind can explain. Your heart races in the presence of dishonesty. Your shoulders tighten around people who drain you. Your breath deepens when you're close to something that feels right. You realize your body has always known the truth, even when your mind denied it, even when your heart was too hopeful to hear it. You begin listening in new ways. You stop asking your mind to make sense of everything and start asking your body how it feels. This relationship with your physical self, this reconnection, isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about honoring the signals you once ignored. The ache wasn't random. The fatigue wasn't laziness. The unease wasn't you being difficult. It was wisdom, waiting patiently for you to listen. Your intuition becomes louder in this season. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It speaks in nudges, in quiet resistance, in dreams you can't shake, and thoughts that won't leave you alone. You learn to recognize the difference between fear and intuition. Fear screams urgency. It says, if you don't act now, you'll lose everything. Intuition, though, intuition is calm. It whispers. It says, you already know. And slowly, you trust it more. You follow the breadcrumbs. You honor the path, even when it doesn't look like anyone else's. Especially then, because you're no longer trying to live someone else's dream. You're trying to remember your own. You begin shedding the need for validation. Not because it doesn't feel good to be seen, but because you no longer need someone else's permission to be who you are. You've spent too long editing your truth for applause, too long shrinking your joy so others feel more comfortable, too long waiting to be chosen. But now you're choosing yourself. Not out of defiance, but devotion. You stop over-explaining. You stop justifying your boundaries. You say no without guilt. You say yes without second-guessing. You wear what feels like you. You speak even if your voice trembles. You dance even if no one joins you. You laugh without checking who's watching. And in doing so, you begin to reclaim the pieces of yourself that you had slowly given away. You begin seeing relationships differently too. Not just romantic ones, but all of them. You no longer prioritize proximity over peace. You stop holding on to people simply because of shared history. You start asking different questions. Do I feel safe here? Can I be honest here? Do I feel seen here? And when the answer is no, you don't force it. You let things end. You grieve what was. But you don't chase. You don't beg. Because you know now that closeness without connection is not love. It's loneliness in disguise. and you're no longer available for the kind of love that requires you to leave yourself behind. In this season, you also start forgiving yourself for the things you did when you didn't know better. The apologies you never gave, the times you stayed too long, the times you left too early, the moments when fear made your decisions for you. You stop judging the past version of you through the lens of who you are now. You begin to see her not as someone broken, but as someone brave. She was trying, she was learning, she was surviving. You take her hand and say, "I'm sorry I've been so hard on you." And in that moment, something inside softens. You realize healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to someone true. You begin honoring rest in ways you never have, not as a reward for productivity, but as a necessity for aliveness. You stop glorifying exhaustion. You stop wearing burnout like a badge. You begin to see rest not as doing nothing, but as doing something sacred. You let yourself nap in the middle of the day. You let your phone die without panic. You let the dishes wait. You light candles for no reason. You go for walks without counting steps. You breathe slower. You move gentler. You exist more than you perform. And the more you do this, the more you feel life returning to your body. You're not just alive, you're living. You start redefining what success looks like. It's no longer about how full your calendar is or how much praise you collect. It's about how your nervous system feels at the end of the day. It's about how much you laughed, how deeply you felt, how honestly you spoke, how kindly you treated yourself when no one was watching. You stop chasing metrics. You start honoring moments. You realize you don't need to achieve more to feel enough. You need to be more present with what already is. And in that shift, your whole life begins to feel more sacred. You begin to see that your emotions are not problems. They are portals. You don't run from sadness anymore. You sit with it. You ask it what it's trying to tell you. You let your tears fall without shame. You let your anger rise without guilt. You don't suppress. You don't ignore. You breathe through. You write it out. You talk it through. You feel it fully. Because now you understand. Emotions are energy, and energy must move. You don't fear your feelings. You trust them, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones, because they are not here to break you. They are here to break you open. And somewhere in this process, this beautiful, messy, holy unraveling, you realize that the life you were always looking for isn't out there. It's not in a partner or a paycheck or a plan. It's here. It's in this breath, this moment, this version of you right now. The one who is learning to listen, the one who is unlearning the noise, the one who is brave enough to let go of what no longer fits, the one who is beginning again, not with certainty, but with sincerity. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You start to feel something unfamiliar, gentle and steady, grow within you, self-trust. Not the kind that needs proof or perfection to feel valid, but the kind that rises from deep within your bones and whispers, "I've got you." It comes not because everything is finally figured out, but because you've decided to stop abandoning yourself every time things get messy. You've decided to stay, and in that staying, you discover a strength that doesn't shout. It's quiet, solid, the kind that doesn't waver when others question your choices, the kind that allows you to make decisions without polling everyone around you. You no longer need everyone's approval to feel at peace. Your own inner knowing has become enough. You no longer chase closure in places where only echoes remain. You stop scrolling through old messages, hoping for a different ending. You stop imagining conversations that will never happen. Instead, you give yourself the closure you were waiting for. You write the words you wish had been said and read them back to yourself. You realize the power isn't in getting answers. It's in deciding that you're done waiting. You stop needing people to understand why you walked away. You stop waiting for someone to acknowledge the hurt. You let it all go, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines you. And in that release, you feel something sacred return to you. Your energy, your clarity, your space to breathe. You start to see your growth not in how much you've achieved, but in how much more you're able to hold without losing your center. You notice it in the way you don't react immediately when triggered, in how you pause and choose to respond instead, in the way you allow others their emotions without trying to fix or absorb them. You don't rush in to fill silence with solutions anymore. You know now that presence is enough, that your groundedness is more powerful than your advice. You don't need to rescue anyone. You simply hold space, and that's more healing than anything you used to offer in your urgency to make it better. You begin honoring your rhythm. You stop pressuring yourself to always be in motion. You understand that rest is not the opposite of progress, it's part of it. You notice the beauty of the in-between moments, the way the world slows down when you let it. You walk slower, you breathe deeper. Give yourself permission to nap without guilt, to cancel plans without explanation. She was surviving. You take her hand and say, "I'm sorry, I've been so hard on you." And in that moment, something inside softens. You realize healing isn't about becoming someone new, it's about returning to someone true. You begin honoring rest in ways you never have, not as a reward for productivity, but as a necessity for aliveness. You stop glorifying exhaustion. You stop wearing burnout like a badge. You begin to see rest not as doing nothing, but as doing something sacred. You let yourself nap in the middle of the day. You let your phone die without panic. You let the dishes wait. You light candles for no reason. You go for walks without counting steps. You breathe slower. You move gentler. You exist more than you perform. And the more you do this, the more you feel life returning to your body. You're not just alive, you're living. You start redefining what success looks like. It's no longer about how full your calendar is or how much praise you collect. It's about how your nervous system feels at the end of the day. It's about how much you laughed, how deeply you felt, how honestly you spoke, how kindly you treated yourself when no one was watching. You stop chasing metrics. You start honoring moments. You realize you don't need to achieve more to feel enough. You need to be more present with what already is. And in that shift, your whole life begins to feel more sacred. You begin to see that your emotions are not problems. They are portals. You don't run from sadness anymore. You sit with it. You ask it what it's trying to tell you. You let your tears fall without shame. You let your anger rise without guilt. You don't suppress, you don't ignore. You breathe through. You write it out. You talk it through. You feel it fully. Because now you understand, emotions are energy, and energy must move. You don't fear your feelings. You trust them, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. Because they are not here to break you, they are here to break you open. And somewhere in this process, this beautiful, messy, holy unraveling, you realize that the life you were always looking for isn't out there. It's not in a partner or a paycheck or a plan. It's here. It's in this breath, this moment, this version of you right now. The one who is learning to listen, the one who is unlearning the noise, the one who is brave enough to let go of what no longer fits, the one who is beginning again, not with certainty, but with sincerity. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. You start to feel something unfamiliar, gentle and steady, grow within you. Self-trust. Not the kind that needs proof or perfection to feel valid, but the kind that rises from deep within your bones and whispers, "I've got you." It comes not because everything is finally figured out, but because you've decided to stop abandoning yourself every time things get messy. You've decided to stay, and in that staying, you discover a strength that doesn't shout. It's quiet, solid, the kind that doesn't waver when others question your choices, the kind that allows you to make decisions without pulling everyone around you. You no longer need everyone's approval to feel at peace. Your own inner knowing has become enough. You no longer chase closure in places where only echoes remain. You stop scrolling through old messages hoping for a different ending. You stop imagining conversations that will never happen. Instead, you give yourself the closure you were waiting for. You write the words you wish had been said and read them back to yourself. You realize the power isn't in getting answers. It's in deciding that you're done waiting. You stop needing people to understand why you walked away. You stop waiting for someone to acknowledge the hurt. You let it all go, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines you. And in that release, you feel something sacred return to you. your energy, your clarity, your space to breathe. You start to see your growth not in how much you've achieved, but in how much more you're able to hold without losing your center. You notice it in the way you don't react immediately when triggered, in how you pause and choose to respond instead, in the way you allow others their emotions without trying to fix or absorb them. You don't rush in to fill silence with solutions anymore. You know now that presence is enough, that your groundedness is more powerful than your advice. You don't need to rescue anyone. You simply hold space, and that's more healing than anything you used to offer in your urgency to make it better. You begin honoring your rhythm. You stop pressuring yourself to always be in motion. You understand that rest is not the opposite of progress, it's part of it. You notice the beauty of the in-between moments, the way the world slows down when you let it. You walk slower, you breathe deeper. You give yourself permission to nap without guilt, to cancel plans without explanation, to be without having to prove your productivity. You start measuring success by how you feel, not how much you get done. You stop glorifying burnout and start honoring balance. And in that space, creativity returns, clarity returns, joy returns. You become less afraid of being misunderstood. You realize now that not everyone has the capacity to see you clearly. And that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their perspective. You no longer contort yourself to fit into places that require you to shrink. You stop over-explaining your boundaries, your preferences, your needs. You speak with clarity and let your words land where they may. You understand now that being understood is a gift, not a requirement. You don't demand it anymore. You just live your truth, and let those who resonate with it draw closer, naturally. You redefine what it means to be strong. You let the old version go, the one that required you to hold everything in, to never cry, to keep moving even when your heart was breaking. That version kept you surviving, but not thriving. Now strength looks different. It looks like resting when you're tired, saying no when it's too much, letting tears fall without shame, asking for help without apology. You stop trying to be invincible and start choosing to be human. And in that humanity, you find a strength that is sustainable, gentle, real. You start trusting divine timing, not in a passive, resigned way, but with a deep, grounded faith that what is meant for you will never pass you by. You stop rushing, you stop comparing, you stop treating your journey like a race. You know now that alignment is more important than speed, that the right things, the right people, the right opportunities, they come when you're ready, not when you're desperate. So you focus on becoming ready. You do the inner work. You clear the space. You stay open. And when it arrives, it doesn't feel like force. It feels like flow. You begin letting joy back in, slowly, tenderly. You no longer feel guilty for laughing during hard times. You don't push joy away just because grief is still present. You've learned that life is big enough to hold both, that sorrow and celebration are not opposites, they're companions. You let joy live in the same space as your sadness. You let yourself feel light even on heavy days. You realize now that joy isn't something you wait for. It's something you create, in small ways, in quiet moments, in the way you talk to yourself, in the way you light a candle, in the way you notice the sky. You make room for joy, not because everything is perfect, but because you deserve to feel alive while you're healing. You stop needing to be the one who holds everything together. You realize that being the strong one, the reliable one, the caretaker, has left you depleted. You were never meant to carry it all, so you begin handing things back, gently but firmly. You let people hold themselves. You let life carry what you no longer can. You let yourself be held too, for once, without guilt. And in doing so, you discover that the world doesn't collapse when you let go, that people still love you when you're not performing, that you are still valuable even when you are not useful. You start seeing beauty in the things you used to overlook, the sound of rain against your window, the way your shadow moves when you dance, the softness in your voice when you speak kindly to yourself. You begin falling in love with your life again, not the future version of it, but the one you're living now. Even in its imperfection, even in its unfinishedness. You don't wait for everything to be resolved before you feel grateful. You feel it now. You feel it often. Gratitude no longer feels like something you have to force. It flows from your presence, from your ability to see what is good, even while healing what hurts. And maybe that's the gift of this season. Not that it fixes everything, but that it invites you back to yourself, that it strips away the noise and the performance and the expectation and leaves you face to face with the truth. You are enough, not because you've done enough, not because you've healed enough, but because you are here, because you keep showing up, because you've chosen to stay. And sometimes that's the most courageous thing anyone can do. There comes a stillness in your soul when you no longer fear being alone with yourself. You used to fill every gap with noise, every pause with distraction. You'd reach for your phone, call someone, scroll endlessly, not because you were curious or connected, but because the quiet was too loud. You feared what would rise in that silence, the memories, the regrets, the doubts, the unmet parts of yourself you'd left unanswered for so long. But now you sit, you let the silence settle around you like a soft blanket instead of a void, and in that silence, you meet yourself. You realize you were never really lonely. You were just disconnected from the one person who needed your love most, you. And now that you've stopped running, you hear her, the voice within, soft at first, then louder, then undeniable. The voice that says, "Welcome home." You begin to feel what alignment truly means. Not perfection, not control, but a sense of coherence between your thoughts, your values, your words, and your actions. It feels like breathing freely, like speaking without rehearsing, like choosing something and not second-guessing it for the rest of the day. It feels like saying no and feeling peace instead of guilt. It feels like entering a room and not wondering who you need to be, but simply being. You realize you've lived so much of your life in distortion, saying one thing while feeling another, doing one thing while needing something else. That distortion created tension, resentment, and a chronic state of inner friction. But now you crave simplicity, authenticity, harmony. You move slower, not to fall behind, but to stay in alignment with yourself. You begin noticing how much of your inner dialogue has been shaped by voices that were never yours to begin with. The teacher who told you your dreams were unrealistic, the parent who only loved you when you were perfect, the partner who withheld affection unless you performed. These voices echo in your head, disguised as your own thoughts, telling you what you can and cannot do. But now you listen closer. You start to separate the voice of your truth from the voices of your conditioning. You start to ask, is this belief helping me or holding me hostage? And slowly you unlearn. You rewrite, you reclaim. You speak back with compassion, not judgment. And over time, the true voice within, the one that's been quieted but never gone, begins to rise. You begin to see that your healing is not linear because your life isn't linear. Some wounds take years to soften. Some days you feel like you've moved on, only to wake up the next day with a fresh wave of grief. You stop seeing that as failure. You stop seeing that as starting over. You see it as spiraling deeper. You realize that every time the pain revisits, you meet it from a new level of awareness, from a new perspective, from a wiser, more grounded self. You don't fear the cycles anymore. You honor them. You understand that healing doesn't mean erasing, it means integrating. It means being able to hold your past without it pulling you back into it. And that is a sacred kind of freedom. You start to see boundaries as bridges instead of walls. Not ways to keep people out, but ways to keep your peace in. You stop setting them from a place of fear and start setting them from a place of clarity. You no longer wait until you're angry or overwhelmed to enforce them. You speak up early, clearly, kindly, and you stop apologizing for it. You realize that anyone who is truly meant to be in your life will respect your boundaries, not because they always understand them, but because they understand you. And if they walk away, you let them, not out of bitterness, but because you've learned that peace is better than proximity, that being respected is better than being tolerated. You begin to heal your relationship with time. You stop seeing your life as a series of deadlines and start seeing it as a landscape, wide, expansive, unfolding in layers. You no longer feel behind. You no longer compare your timeline to someone else's. You stop rushing your dreams. You stop measuring your worth by how much you've achieved by a certain age. You let go of the pressure to arrive, and instead, you arrive here, in the present, in the process. You start asking, what does my life feel like? Instead of, what does it look like from the outside? And when the answers come, you follow them. Not the clock, not the crowd, not the checklist. You let your soul set the pace. You find yourself drawn to depth over drama. You stop craving relationships that feel like roller coasters. You no longer associate intensity with intimacy. You want steady now. You want calm. You want the kind of love that feels like coming home, not like constant adrenaline. And that shift changes everything. You no longer chase people who make you question your worth. You choose people who remind you of it. You choose those who mirror your growth, your gentleness, your intention. You stop performing for love. You let love meet you where you are. And when it doesn't, you no longer assume it's your fault. You simply acknowledge the mismatch and walk away with grace. You start celebrating progress in ways that no one else may notice. The way you now speak up when something feels off. The way you no longer try to fix everything for everyone. The way you take time to pause, to breathe, to check in with yourself. These moments might be invisible to the outside world, but you see them, you feel them, you honor them. Because you know now that the biggest victories are often the quietest ones. They happen in your inner world. In the way your thoughts have softened, in the way your self-talk has shifted, in the way your nervous system feels more settled. You stop waiting for applause. You stop needing external validation. You clap for yourself, silently, sincerely, consistently. You begin to value solitude not as absence but as presence, as space, as medicine. You realize how often you've rushed to fill the gaps, calling someone, making plans, escaping into screens. But now you lean into those gaps. You sit in the quiet and discover it's not empty. It's full of messages you've been too busy to hear. You begin creating intentional space in your day. Time to be with yourself, to ask how you're doing, to move slowly, to dream. And in that space, you begin to feel more connected, not just to yourself, but to something greater, to the rhythm of life, to the stillness that holds all things, to the wisdom that rises only when the noise dies down. And somewhere in this season, this unfolding, this unbecoming, this becoming, you realize that the life you're building now is not based on who you think you should be, but on who you truly are. You stop constructing yourself for acceptance. You start remembering yourself for alignment. You don't need to be anyone else's version of successful, lovable, or enough. You are not a project to perfect. You are a presence to embody. And in that embodiment, you discover a kind of peace that doesn't come from arrival, but from return. A return to self, to truth, to the steady, sacred rhythm of your own becoming. You begin to realize that grace is not just something you extend to others. It's something you offer yourself. You used to reserve compassion for everyone else, excusing their mistakes, understanding their silence, accepting their inconsistencies. But when it came to you, your standards were ruthless. You criticized yourself for every misstep, replayed every awkward conversation, judged yourself for not healing fast enough. But now slowly you soften. You offer yourself the kindness you so freely give to others. You look back on your past and instead of shame, you feel tenderness. You see how hard you were trying, how deep your hurt was, how brave it was to keep showing up anyway. You stop using your healing as another way to measure your worth. You allow yourself to be a work in progress, not perfect, just present, just willing. You begin to reclaim your narrative. You no longer let others write your story for you or define your identity based on how they interpreted your past. You used to internalize their version of you, the one who was too emotional, too intense, too sensitive, the one who needed to tone it down, stay in line, fit into molds you never chose. But now you take the pen back. You look at your life and say, This is mine. You stop being the character in someone else's story and start becoming the author of your own. You write your chapters with honesty, even when they're messy. You stop editing out the grief, the rage, the longing, because they are part of the plot too. They shaped your resilience. They deepened your empathy. They carved out space for more joy, more meaning, more you. You realize that not every ending is a failure. Some things fall apart to redirect you, to release you, to wake you up. You look back at the moments that once shattered you and see the lessons buried beneath the rubble. You see how you were being rerouted, not rejected. You stop romanticizing what almost worked. You stop trying to make sense of why something ended when your heart was still holding on. You learn to trust the wisdom of what leaves. That maybe the closure you wanted was the very act of it closing. That some people were never meant to stay, not because you weren't enough, but because you were growing beyond what they could hold. And now you thank the endings. Not with bitterness, but with reverence. You start to feel safety within yourself. You no longer rely on someone else's presence to calm your anxiety. You stop outsourcing your peace. You learn to be your own grounding place. You create rituals that bring you back. Music that soothes, breaths that steady, words that anchor. You no longer spiral into panic every time uncertainty knocks. You know how to hold yourself now. You know that you've survived every moment you once thought you couldn't. That strength lives in your body. That wisdom lives in your breath. And with each moment you stay instead of escape, soothe instead of suppress, choose presence over panic. You build trust in yourself that nothing outside you can shake. You begin to find meaning in the in-between. You used to wait for the milestones, the new job, the relationship, the breakthrough, to feel like you were living. You measured your life in checkboxes and timelines, but now you notice the holiness of the mundane. You wake up slowly, you make your coffee with intention, you feel the warmth of sunlight on your skin and let it be enough. You stop chasing the next thing long enough to notice this thing, this moment, this breath, this quiet peace you created. You understand now that the miracle isn't just in the mountaintop, it's in the climb, in the pauses, in the ordinary days that don't seem extraordinary until you look back and realize they were everything. You stop waiting to be chosen. You used to contort yourself into palatable versions, hoping someone would see your worth. You thought if you were impressive enough, attractive enough, selfless enough, someone would finally say, "You're the one." But now you choose yourself. You don't wait to be picked. You show up for your own heart like you used to show up for others. You take yourself on walks, talk to yourself gently, hold space for your own needs. You realize that being chosen by someone else will never feel fulfilling if you haven't first chosen yourself. And when you do, the world changes. Not because it suddenly gives you more, but because you stop looking for your reflection in places that only offer distortion. You begin honoring your capacity. You stop expecting yourself to show up at 100% every single day. You recognize that some days your energy is low, your mind is tired, your heart is tender. And instead of fighting it, you honor it. You do what you can, and you let that be enough. You stop glorifying overextension. You no longer push past your limits just to prove something. You listen, you rest, you trust that your worth is not tied to your output, that your value doesn't disappear when you pause. And in that space of honoring your capacity, you begin to feel more whole, not because you're doing more, but because you're finally doing what's real. You start forgiving yourself for all the ways you tried to survive, for trusting people who couldn't hold you, for staying in places that harmed you, for shrinking yourself to stay safe. You look at those versions of yourself and see courage where you once saw weakness. You realize that everything you did, every pattern, every silence, every compromise, was done with the tools you had at the time. And now you have new tools, new awareness, new boundaries. So you don't shame the old you. You thank her. You say, "You got me here, I'll take it from here." And that shift from blame to gratitude is where deep healing begins. You begin to understand that authenticity is your superpower, not the kind of authenticity that's curated or performative, but the raw, honest kind that doesn't need to be explained. You stop filtering your emotions. You stop hiding your truth. You stop toning yourself down to be more acceptable. You speak with clarity even if your voice trembles. You cry without apologizing. You celebrate your wins even if no one claps. You laugh loudly, you rest openly. You exist without explanation. And the more you do, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're trying to be seen, but because you've stopped trying to be anything else but yourself. You find yourself drawn to people who feel like safety, like ease, like home. You no longer chase the high of chaos, the unpredictability of inconsistent love. You want soft now, steady now. You want conversations that don't leave you anxious, connections that don't require recovery. You want the kind of relationships where silence isn't uncomfortable, where vulnerability isn't a risk, where presence isn't earned. You no longer settle for crumbs. You wait for the feast. You wait for those who don't just tolerate your truth, but treasure it. And while you wait, you sit at your own table, fully nourished, fully whole. And in all of this quiet unfolding, this slow return, this sacred unbecoming, you realize that you are not healing to become someone else. You are healing to return to yourself, to the softness you buried, to the curiosity you silenced, to the wildness you dimmed. You are not becoming someone new. You are remembering who you were before the world told you to be someone else. And that remembering, that is your becoming. There's a kind of wisdom that only reveals itself in stillness. Not in the rushing, not in the striving, but in the moments when you let the world quiet enough to hear your own soul speak. And you've begun to notice it now. The way your breath steadies when you're honest. The way your shoulders drop when you stop pretending. The way your eyes soften when you forgive yourself. You used to move so fast thinking clarity would come if you just kept going, if you just did enough, tried hard enough, proved yourself enough. But it never did. It came when you paused, when you allowed the silence to settle around you like fog. And in that fog, you found something sacred, yourself. Not the version you edited for the world, but the one who lives quietly beneath all the noise. The one who always knew the way, even when you didn't know how to ask. You begin to trust that your path doesn't need to look like anyone else's to be real. You used to measure your worth against timelines that weren't yours. You believed there was some universal pace, some silent rule that said you had to be somewhere else by now. That if you weren't achieving fast enough, growing fast enough, healing fast enough, you were failing. But now you slow down. You redefine success as presence, as alignment, as feeling peace at the end of the day. You start walking in your own rhythm. You say no to the pressure to keep up and yes to the moments that ground you. You no longer chase, you choose. And in choosing your pace, you begin to feel life meet you where you are, not where you were told to be. You begin to understand that not every part of you needs to be fixed. Some parts just need to be heard, held, hugged in silence. You stop dissecting every thought. You stop pathologizing every feeling. You no longer look at your sadness like it's a flaw or your anxiety like it's a malfunction. You begin to see them for what they are. Parts of your humanity asking for space. You give them that space. You let your inner critic soften into curiosity. You ask your fear what it needs instead of trying to silence it. You begin treating yourself like someone you love, someone you're learning to love better each day. And that shift, that's the beginning of real transformation, not through force, through compassion. You find healing not in grand gestures, but in ordinary moments, in brushing your hair slowly, in sipping tea while watching the sunrise, in saying thank you to your body after a long day. You used to wait for breakthroughs, big dramatic shifts that would make everything make sense. But now you see the miracle in the mundane. You understand that healing is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, gentle, almost invisible to the outside world. But you feel it in your breath, in your reactions, in your ability to sit with discomfort and not run from it. You begin to realize that every time you choose presence over perfection, you are healing. Every time you meet yourself without judgment, you are healing. And you're doing it day by day, breath by breath. You stop hiding your softness. You spent so long trying to be tough, to be strong, to be unaffected. But it made you hard. It made you tired. it made you lonely. You thought vulnerability was weakness. You thought tenderness would leave you broken. But now you see it's the opposite. That the bravest thing you can do is stay soft in a world that tries to make you numb. You cry without apology. You speak with honesty, even when your voice shakes. You offer love without conditions. You hold hands without needing to know the outcome. And in that softness, you feel your strength return, not as armor, but as truth, as presence, as power that doesn't need to prove itself. You stop expecting everyone to understand your journey. You realize now that some people will only ever meet you at the version of themselves they see in you. You stop explaining your growth to those who didn't witness your breaking. You don't need their permission. You don't need their praise. You know who you are becoming, and more than that, you know who you are unbecoming. You stop needing to be validated in rooms where you feel like a stranger. You stop dimming your light to fit into spaces that only celebrate what they can define. You shine, not for approval, but because you finally stopped hiding. And whoever sees you now, truly sees you, is meant to walk beside you. You begin to understand that some things were never meant to be understood, only accepted. You stop digging for why certain people left, why the timing didn't work, why something you love slipped away. You accept that not every question has an answer that will soothe you. Some things just are. Some stories end abruptly. Some wounds don't come with clean closure. But even in that, you begin to find peace. You stop needing certainty to move forward. You start walking with faith instead. You trust that what was meant for you stayed, and what left created space for something better. You release the obsession with making everything make sense. You breathe, you bow to the mystery, and in that surrender you feel free. You begin to live more gently, not just with others, but with yourself. You no longer rush your healing. You don't try to outperform your pain. You don't need every day to be productive. Some days you just rest. You let yourself be human. You allow the ebbs as much as the flows. You let grief sit beside you without demanding it explain itself. You stop trying to be constantly okay. You realize that true peace isn't about being unaffected. It's about being anchored. And your anchor now is presence, not control, not perfection, just being here, just being honest, just being kind. You start to notice the ways you've already changed. The things that once triggered you now make you pause instead. The moments where you used to lash out, you now take a breath.